now the parsha. There are two big problems, or at least big questions, that leap off the page, right on the surface in Parashat Mishpatim. And there are two different kinds, and one is early in the parasha and one is late. The first one is, we just got done with the revelation of the Ten Commandments at Sinai, right? That's how Yitro ends last week. And it's big, right? It's theological, it's moral in deep and large ways, right? And then, okay, what's next, right? What's next week? And we turn the page, we come in the next week, and we start getting all these little picky rules, right? What happened, right? We were like at this big crescendo and we lost it. And now we've got all these other like little things, one after another, no particular clear moral scheme or theological. I mean, we're very good at mining those things for moral or theological significance, but something has happened, right? Like what happened? That's problem one. And Jewish tradition recognizes this problem and faces it squarely and offers various ideas about it, right? The second problem happens at the end, and Jewish tradition does not face the problem squarely and tries to make it go away. The problem at the end is that God calls Moses and the elders of Israel up to God's presence, and they see God, right? The text strongly indicates physically, right? I'm reading right from the text. Vayir'u et Elohei Yisrael, and they saw the God of Israel, right? This can't be, right? It is like if there is a first principle of Jewish cosmology, it is that, at least as we know it, is that God has no physical form, right? God cannot be seen, and because this is a big problem, right? The tradition has done what it often does. It tries to make it go away, right? There's it doesn't really mean they saw God. If you read the commentary in the Eitz Chaim, right, you'll see an example, right? Totally central casting kind of example, where it says that, but that's not what it means, right? It means they perceived God in a particularly acute way, but that's not what it says. And in fact, the rest of the pasuk is a very weird rest of the pasuk if it doesn't actually mean that they saw God in a visual, physical way, because we get a physical description, right? V'tachat raglav, l'maaseh livnat hasapir, and under his feet was this pavement of sap. This sounds like the relation of a concrete visual. They saw God, right? And a fair amount of rabbinic ingenuity over the years has been devoted to making it go away. They did not see God, or to pretending it isn't there, right? Because it's a pretty big problem. Each of these two problems can be answered on its own terms, I think, pretty adequately by taking a step back and regarding the Torah as a pastiche of texts rather than a unified one, right? That is to say, to the first problem, we say the Torah is a text written in multiple genres. Right? Some of those genres are more poetry-like, and some are more prose-like. Some are about the great big things, and some are about the smaller things, and some of them are narratives, and some of right? So we got two different things, and they're stapled together. Like that happens. It's normal, right? And the second one, sort of similarly, can be addressed by saying that the Torah isn't a document written all at once, having in mind all of the things that we would come to know as the fundamental principles of Judaism. That's a text accreted over the course of many generations, and that is a matter of the history of Jewish thought. The idea that God can have no visible form is a relatively late entrant, right? Late relative to the Torah text as we know it, right? Into Jewish orthodoxy, small o. And each of those ideas, each of those answers, right, resolves the problem, and each answer is a good answer on its own terms, right? But giving these answers comes at a cost, right? It comes at the cost of our ability to tell a unified story about Parashat Mishpatim, right? So what I want to do with the next couple of minutes is try to offer such a unified story in a way that makes sense of these two problems, right? And the story goes like this. Parashat Mishpatim is the story of God's slow recovery from having been rejected by the Israelites at Sinai. That's the story, as I want to tell it, to make sense of these problems, right? Here's what I mean. Sinai is supposed to be God's big moment, right? It's revelation. God's been doing all these miracles in Egypt, at the sea, right? In the desert. God has mostly been communicating through Moses, right? And Sinai is the big moment when God is finally going to meet the people squarely, right? And they're going to establish the direct relationship. And so we get the build up to Sinai and we get the revelation. And God begins to speak to the people, right? Through the Dibrot. And the people freak out, right? They can't handle it, right? Right away, they tell Moshe, make it stop, right? Make it stop. We can't listen to this. We have to go away, right? And the people leave the mountain. And God gives the other commandments just to Moses, not to the people, right? Various traditions tell us. And the people have to stand at a distance, right? And if God's going to say more, it's got to be just to Moses. And God feels rejected, right? God tried to establish a direct relationship with the people, and the people didn't want it. And that, it's theologically challenging to say something like, and that hurts, right? But I kind of want to say, either it hurts or in some other way, God diagnoses a problem, right? This relationship of leadership and peoplehood is not going to go down right now quite the way God envisioned when God decided to speak directly to the people. And there has to be some adjustment. So in Parashat Mishpatim, God tries out a couple of strategies of adjustment for a different relationship with the people, right? A different strategy of leadership. The first one goes like this. God thinks, the problem was I went too big, right? I went too big. So I got to go small. And we get the beginning of Parashat Mishpatim, right? Instead of these like very large, ambitious, totalizing, deep injunctions and principles, that's what the people freaked out about, we get a bunch of little things, right? God thinks maybe I can bring them in that way. Maybe that's the level at which I can conduct this relationship. But it's still not quite working. And so God says, okay, second strategy. The problem is me. Right? The problem is, actually, God being infallible would say the problem is I. The problem is me. The problem is that who I really am is not someone who the people can handle and relate to. I have to change, or at least I have to appear to change. I have to present myself to the people as something that I'm not quite, but that's more relatable to them. And that might be something with a physical form. Maybe something with a physical form is more relatable to the people than some abstract, unseen, invisible force. So I'm going to conjure a physical image of myself and let the people see it. I think there is a textual clue to this story that I think of as the third problem of Parashat Mishpatim, although I'm presenting it here as a solution. But it's not much noticed. And it's this. The leader in God's position, as I'm telling the story, the one who had the big moment and it didn't work and then struggles with the question of how to perform leadership from that point and tries out various different strategies, is suffering a problem of voice. Right? It's like, I don't know what my voice should be. I'm going to try speaking small instead of big. I'm going to try speaking in a voice that's not quite my own. Right? God is struggling to find a different voice. And the textual clue to this is something that's missing from Parashat Mishpatim, which is what I think of as the most common typical sentence in the Torah, right? Vayomer or Vayedaber Adonai El. In the book of Exodus, it would be Moshe, Lemor. Search Mishpatim high and low for this sentence and you will not find it. It's not there. Right? The parsha, it would be normal for a parsha to begin, Vayedaber Adonai El Moshe Lemor. 1, 2. Ele HaMishpatim. These are the laws. No, but that's not how Mishpatim starts. Mishpatim just starts with Ele HaMishpatim, right? Because God's normal voice is lost. God does not feel comfortable speaking in God's own normal voice. He's saying that aside. After God tries the first strategy, we know that God thinks it's not quite working, because in the transition to the second strategy, when God says to Moses, "Come up with the elders and see me," we get this very strange sentence about what God says. It's at the beginning of chapter 24, making that transition. It said, in a place where we would expect to see "Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor," it just says "Ve'el Moshe Amar." And to Moses he said, who said? Where else in the Torah do we get "Ve'el someone Amar"? And that introduces the statement of God. The Torah introduces God speaking by saying "Vayedaber" or "Vayomer Adonai el," name of person, lemor. God does not have God's voice back yet. It's tentative. It's halting. It's still experimenting with new different things, and it's not a full voice of that character. Only after the people come up and see God, only after the episode with Vayiru with Elohei Israel, do we get Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, which is as close as we're going to come in this parasha to Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, right? It's almost back, right? God feels after that second strategy that, okay, I got something. I got most of it back. That was enough. It's relatable. We can go forward from here. I want to suggest that the first of these two strategies, I went big and I went too big, and so now I have to go small. It has pluses and minuses, right? And it's a discretionary judgment call of leadership, successful and less successful, about when to make it, right? Second strategy is a big problem. The second strategy, though it feels to God in the moment like it's mostly back because we at least get Vayomer Adonai, the second strategy is a big problem. Because if you change who you are, or you change how you appear, you set in motion things that are going to be destructive to the leadership that you're trying to enact. Because it's not really you anymore, right? You're pretending, you're faking. And we know that the Torah tells us this is a big problem. Why? Because what happens next in the story? Next, Moses goes up the mountain. We get a break, right? Teruma Titzaveh, with all kinds of little details about what Moses is learning on the mountain, about the Mishkan. But when we return to the narrative, the next thing that happens is Chet HaEgel. The next thing that happens is the golden calf. And God is really, really angry about the golden calf. And why is God so angry about the golden calf? I want to suggest that God is angry because God looks at the calf and says, what's the sin? The sin is the people have made a physical artifact to lay eyes upon, to think of as the God of Israel. You know what makes us angriest in the various mistakes that our children make? It's when we recognize that there are mistakes repeated, right? They just say, you see something and you think that's not right, and then you think, oh, I did that. I taught that lesson and it's being played out. And it shouldn't make you mad or at your kid, but it should make you mad or at yourself. And sometimes you express, and you feel anger and frustration, and God feels it. Because God looks at the ego and says, I did that. I made a physical form, trying to get something done, and they made a physical form. Leadership is tough. And it often requires adjustment when things don't go the way you thought they were going to, or planned, or hoped for, right? If your community, whatever community is you're trying to lead, isn't ready for something really, really big, sometimes you have to think about going smaller, right? And going smaller, it doesn't always mean going trivial, right? There's stuff in what I'm describing as smaller that's kind of important, right? It's not as big as that other thing. Sometimes you have to make that decision, right? Sometimes, if you can't spend an enormous amount of money to cure most of society's ills and save the planet, maybe you can spend a still considerable amount of money at least to save the planet without doing everything else. Sometimes you have to go smaller. But don't respond by changing who you are, right? That's the second strategy. If you make that mistake, you will regret it later. That, at any rate, is the story that I offer to solve these two problems about Parshat Mishpatim. Shabbat Shalom.